Today on The Big Questions, will COVID help us save the planet? And do we misunderstand Jesus? Good morning, I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. We are back in our Manchester studio with socially distanced guests. And today our virtual audience is joining us via the big screen from the southwest of England. They're safe in the comfort of their own homes, as are two more guests who are taking part via screens. Welcome everybody to The Big Questions. This week, the results of the largest ever worldwide survey on climate change were released. The United Nations Development Programme questioned 1.2 million people across 50 countries. Two-thirds of them classed climate change as a global emergency. It found that Britons were the most concerned nation surveyed, with 4/5 agreeing with that proposition. But we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and right now many would argue we have different priorities. Has the pandemic helped us make some of the changes needed to tackle the environmental crisis? As our lives have changed and we've stayed home, pollution and greenhouse gas emissions have fallen. Will COVID help us save the planet? George Monbiot, it's a seismic moment, this, in human history, isn't it? I mean, a chance to reset our relationship with nature, with the animal kingdom, to address climate change, to try and slow down that catastrophe. But you know what we're like. Ain't gonna happen.
Well, it's only at these moments that we really get a chance to change things. If you think about the Second World War, when that ended, and the way that Clement Attlee put the economy and indeed the politics of this country on a completely different footing, to the great benefit of all of us. We had a similar chance in 2008 after the financial crisis, but we didn't take it. The government just tried to get us back into the old dirty business that caused the crisis in the first place. But this could be the biggest chance we've ever had, because we see the government, to a greater extent than for many decades, supporting the economy and directing the economy. So let's direct it in a greener direction. Instead of trying to get back to the old dirty and destructive model of business, let's get into a green economy, an economy whose purpose is to make sure that everybody is well off, nobody falls behind, while at the same time we don't destroy our life support system.
But we're going to have such social deprivation and such inequality. We already are. But in years going ahead, because of this, people's priorities will not be ancient woodlands. They will be putting food on the table and cranking up the economy so we can do that.
Well, it's a complete myth that these two things are in conflict. We can restart the economy on green principles in ways which ensure that people are prosperous and that prosperity is widely shared. At the moment, that prosperity is very badly shared, and a lot of people depend on food banks for their very survival. An outrageous situation in one of the richest countries on earth. But what we've got to recognise here, Nicky, is that, there's two emergencies here. There's a pandemic, but there's also the environmental emergency, the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, and that's by far the bigger of those emergencies. The pandemic is horrendous. It's a massive nightmare, but the environmental emergency is an even bigger nightmare, because we're talking about our very survival and the survival of future generations. And if we don't get this right, then the deprivation and the suffering caused by the pandemic will pale into insignificance by comparison.
But COVID may well divert our minds from the path that we were on and from that realization that it is catastrophic for the planet, because it's now about immediate economic survival. But we have, Fraser Myers, we have to do this. We have to change. We have to address this. Look, do you remember, everybody, in the first lockdown, when there were no planes in the sky, when we could hear the birds, people nodding sort of wistfully and nostalgically? Do you remember that time? It was beautiful. Would you like that, something of that, to be a new normal?
No, I don't think it was beautiful, to be honest with you. I think that, we're living under some of the most extreme restrictions that have ever been imposed in a liberal democracy, and the consequences of this, whether they're necessary or not, that's a completely different argument. The consequences have been have been incredible for so many people, and they've fallen disproportionately on the poor. The fact is that across the world, there's an extra 350 million people unemployed, in the past year or so.
And disproportionately, the poor are dying.
Yes, that's true. But what I'm saying is that we're living through a period of restraint and austerity. I don't think there is going to be a lot of appetite for yet more restraint. And I think, in fact, it would be immoral to call for yet more restraint, because we need to, we need to get the economy back on track. We need to get back to growth. Now more than ever, we need to be expanding our potential and, getting people to higher living standards.
I'm so glad you brought morality into this. We stand and fall on that. Danielle, I saw your reaction when Fraser said, no, I did not like that. I don't think that should be the new normal. The time when we had that little bit of serenity upon us. How do you want to respond?
I think it's extraordinary to think it wasn't a pleasant thing. But this is an opportunity. I think George is right. But I think unless we change the wiring, unless we move the economy from a dig and gig economy to something much more sustaining of life, we're going to go back to something where the poor do die in disproportionate numbers, where inequality runs rife through our society. We can't carry on in that vein. There is an opportunity now, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this is a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of movement in that direction.
Where's your faith in humanity?
You could say that at the beginning of the lockdown there was a lot of solidarity and good feeling, and yes, I think that was a feeling that many people shared. We can't go back to the old ways, but I think a year on, people are really struggling. People are struggling to put food on the table. The unemployment is going through the roof, even with the unprecedented government protections. And I think it's kind of a bit of a fantasy. It's not really living in the real world to feel wistful about this moment, to use it as a moment to reflect. People are really suffering right now, and let's hope that this is over soon.
How much, George, will people here and also globally be suffering in the years to come if we don't urgently address the climate change catastrophe?
It's impossible to tell how big this is going to be, but it's going to affect billions unquestionably, not least because large parts of the surface of the Earth just become too hot and too dry to support most people's lives. We're going to be affected less than those living in the hottest and driest parts of the world, but it will come to us as well. And already, as we've seen with recent floods and other extreme events, we see a ramping up of the dangers of climate breakdown, even in temperate countries with comparatively stable climates such as our own. So we can't ignore this. We can't pretend that this is something we can just sweep under the carpet. And one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is that we can change in response to emergencies when we need to.
And there is money.
Governments can find money when they want to find money. We've been told for years, oh, there isn't any money to deal with the environmental crisis. We don't have enough. Well, when they want to find the money is there. We've been told, oh, people would never put up with any changes to their lifestyles. They won't be prepared to fly less or use their bicycle rather than their car. But what we've discovered with the pandemic is that when people are called upon to act, they'll take far more extreme action than environmentalists have ever called for, staying in our own homes, scarcely going out at all. We're not calling for that as environmentalists, but when it is called for by a government, and when the government makes it abundantly clear that we have to do this for the good of all, we are prepared to step up. So
Fraser
a lot of
Myers.
the myths about what governments can't do and people can't do, those have been exploded by our
George,
response to
let
the
me
pandemic.
put that to Fraser, and I see lots of people are moving in our audience, ready to say something. I feel it. I saw some nodding and I saw some hands up, so I'll be right with you. Fraser, respond to what you heard from John.
Well, I think there is a big difference between what people were asked to do temporarily for the pandemic. I think people, most people have an expectation that this will be over and their lives will go back to normal. And I think people will be wanting to travel and see the world a hell of a lot more when this is done. People will think, look at all the things that I've been missing out on. I mean, I can't even just things like going on a night out. I'm never going to turn one of those down ever again. People realise that they...
There's somebody inviting you for a night out.
Exactly.
Calling right now.
I think people have... I don't think people are going to grow used to this. We've learned what it's like to live a reduced and, kind of nothing life. We're existing. We're not really living, and so I don't see that as a model for going forward.
Right with you.
And the strains are beginning, the cracks are beginning to form. People are starting to
Danny,
riot.
we're existing. We're what was that phrase? We're existing.
We're existing, not living.
We're existing, not living, from the great philosopher.
Well, beyond that, just to bring this back to the environmental discussion, you mentioned that these trends are temporary. And we know now that we are moving in a direction where more people are working from home. And according to research commissioned by MasterCard, 2/3 of UK shoppers are shopping more locally today than they did a year ago. In addition to that, people, I think, personally, and I think many people watching this at home would agree, have a renewed appreciation for the environment today. They are taking advantage. People are going more outside when they have the opportunity to because of the COVID pandemic. And I think that there is going to be a resurgence towards more environmental awareness.
There's going to be an orgy of spending, an orgy of consumerism, isn't there, when we come out of this? It's going to be the roaring 20s, and our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are paying for this. So surely the argument is we need to crank up the economy. Namisha, what do you think? I saw you wanting to come in on this. Do you think things will ever be the same again?
Well, I think that in terms of the pandemic, we've seen how global governance has rose in prominence, and we've seen states kind of stray away from this state-centric interpretation of finding solutions. They've worked in the World Health Organization, cooperated with other states, and I think this renewed sense of diplomacy will in turn help us solve the borderless issues of global warming, climate change, and hopefully then we can kind of ensure that we're not solely focused on anthropocentric kind of issues, and we actually realize that we live in a world that's shared by many people, not just us, but with animals, and hopefully we can ensure that generations yet to come can also enjoy the things that we do today, because renewable energy is the future, and we can no longer depend on fossil fuels for energy when we know that it will become obsolete, and in turn this will disproportionately affect all of us.
Yeah, and it's very important that international bodies cooperate with each other. It's going terribly well between the United Kingdom and the European Union. That's working like a dream so far. Linda, yeah, please do come in. On this point, on this central question, is there something about what we're living through at the moment that will concentrate our minds, that it will help us save the planet? Linda.
Okay, I think you make some very valid points. However, we need to see this as an opportunity for change, for positive change. We've been through the horror of over 100,000 people dying in this country alone. However, what unites the whole world is COVID. Every single human being on this planet has been affected by COVID. It's a time to unite humanity. However, in terms of greener initiatives, we need to embrace them. We have to. It's a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For example, using bicycles to commute, both for our physical and our mental health. However, we need the infrastructure in place. We need the government to fund traffic-free routes that are usable by people. In the first month of the lockdown last year in March, the deaths of cyclists on the roads actually doubled in terms of fatalities from the previous year, from March the previous year. And one of the reasons was that although there were less cars on the road, the mindset of drivers were more likely to engage in dangerous, hazardous driving that caused death. So we need education.
Okay, let me hold it there. However, it's education, and it's also what you're saying, at the heart of what you're saying is a massive change to our psychological mindset. I think that's a really, really good point.
Definitely.
Karen, can we do it? I mean, I was reading something that you tweeted about the precipitous decline in the shark population. Not only beautiful creatures, but vital for ecosystems. All that is so depressing. We have to do something. What is the most important thing that we as human beings have to do?
I think you seized it immediately, and it's the change of mindset, because there's all this conversation that assumes that we can have whatever we want and make tiny little changes in our lifestyles, and that will be enough. and it won't be enough. It won't be enough. We could have very sensible government policies that invest in green energy. We could have, policies that encourage people to work from home more and avoid air travel. That will still not be enough. And I, in a way, agree with my colleague over
Fraser,
here.
in a way.
In a way, in the sense that I do not think people will change their relationship to the natural world. They won't restrain consumption willingly. People will agree to things that are done in a temporary fashion that they would not agree for as a longer-term solution. We need to dramatically reduce our impact on this planet.
Okay, well, Nimisha mentioned there about we have to reset our relationship with the animal kingdom, clearly. But how do we dramatically reduce our impact on the planet, which is taking habitat, of course, and contributing to the sixth great extinction, is it?
Yeah.
But what do we as human beings have to do in our own lives? People watching right now.
People have to understand that just because you can do something, because it's available to you, because someone has, made a business out of selling you something that is cheap, doesn't mean that you should do it. Just because no one is stopping you from doing something doesn't mean that it's okay for you to do it.
What about population?
One of those things is having children, because by far and away, nothing we do has as much of an impact as having children. We're creating entire lifetimes of consumption, new people that are going to be vulnerable to a planet that no longer can really reliably provide for our needs because it's been so abused over the last several decades of human overpopulation. Climate change is driven primarily by economic growth and population growth, and nothing we do to make our lives more efficient, reduce marginally our impact, won't do anything if we're still multiplying our numbers.
It's a marginal impact anyway. We can do that. We can have a massive change of psychological mindset and maybe do, as you say, enough fewer children. But how do you persuade that to happen in India or in Africa?
They don't do persuading. I mean, we saw the one-child policy in China. What a disaster that was. I think, on a lot of these environmental issues, it's one thing saying we should do this, we should do that, we should all take our own choices to cut down on X, Y, Z. But if at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is going to be imposed on us. Again, if that's the route we decide to go down, if we decide to go down a kind of net zero route, what happens if you don't want, someone to come into your house and retrofit everything? What do you do? What do you do?
You're worried about George Orwell said the jackboot on the human face, aren't you?
A little bit. I mean, because because essentially,
and that's why we need a bottom-up approach to environmentalism, and the market has already been shifting in that direction. If we look at, for example, BP, who have pledged to slash in half oil and gas production that they've been doing, and they've been transitioning to electric vehicle charging infrastructure. If we look at Tesla, it's the most valuable automotive company in the world today as a result of exploding demand for electric vehicles. At the same time, we can see companies such as DPD who are responsible for delivery, and they have overachieved their commitment to turn most of their vehicles into electric vehicles as well. So we need a bottom-up approach, which isn't unforced to the top, because I did hear earlier before allusions to the fact that this should be all top-down and all state-centric. Well, if you break down, for example, the Guardian's list of the top 100 polluters, which are responsible for 75% of emissions, and you break down the top 50, you'll find 31 of them are state-owned companies. You'll find that a further 16 are state-subsidised companies. You'll find that a further 2 are partially owned by the government, and you'll find that just 1 is a non-subsidised private company. So we need a balanced approach which leverages the best of the harnesses, ultimately, the ingenuity of entrepreneurs and ecopreneurs and small businesses up and down the country, because it's becoming profitable nowadays to be environmentally friendly.
If you have a load of money and a choice between investing in plastics or investing in renewables, you'd be mad to invest in the former, wouldn't you? It would be renewables. That's what you go for. Isn't that hope, the green pound, the impetus of economic achievement by going on the road to you don't buy that.
Well, that's again sticking to the idea that we can have everything that we want. We can have economic growth forever. We can have technology overcoming all the obstacles in our ways, and we never refrain from doing exactly what we want at any particular time, irrespective of costs. And that's just an illusion, and it's a selfish and irresponsible thing that we do. We do need to accept that we can't do everything that we want. There are
Most
too many
people
of
in
us.
the world
There are
can't
too
even get
many
close
of
to
us.
doing half the things they want.
Absolutely,
There is so
you're
much poverty.
very right.
A lot of people
right.
in Britain are not,
And
people are not being
notwithstanding-
selfish, over-consuming. They're not consuming
excuse me,
enough most of the time. They
you
don't
made
have
a
the
point
resources.
earlier because you tried to dismiss the entirety of population concerns, saying, well, it has been done badly in the past.
I do dismiss
Fraser.
these.
No,
I dismiss these concerns. Sorry. Can I explain?
It's easy to just dismiss this and then what? Like, what is your bottom line? If it's 20 billion of us, is that too many? Or
why
what,
would there be
30
too many
billion?
people?
40 billion?
These arguments about population.
Why
have
would
been
that
had
be
in
too
the
many
past-
people?
Is there
Well,
a
it's not too many
number
people.
for you
There's
that would be
why
too
would there
many?
be there's no maximum limit on the population. I mean, if you think
No
about the arguments
forests,
that,
no trees, no wildlife, no elephants,
capacity,
no
why would
orangutan,
food
no
for
gorillas.
everybody?
why would all this? Why
Those things are happening
people are
right
very
now.
fond. People
Those
are very
things are
fond of
happening
Wait a minute,
right
everyone.
now.
Wait a minute,
wants to get rid of
everyone. Wait a minute, everyone. I'll come to the zoo with you. All right. George, you've written a lot about rewilding. Let's get back to population. There's no top limit, says Fraser. We can cope.
Well, I mean, there are obviously limits because we keep bashing up against environmental limits all the time already. I do think, actually, that environmentalists on the whole have overemphasized population and underemphasized consumption, which is growing much faster than population and tends to have much worse impacts. The growth of consumption, the growth of the flights we take, the amount of meat we eat, the amount of plastic we consume, all of these things are actually more urgent issues than the growth in the population rate, which has slowed now to just 1% a year, where it was previously way above 2%. So we're looking at a demographic transition already taking place. That's not to say that human population growth has no impact. It's going to have its highest impact in parts of Africa, where it's going to remain higher than in many other parts of the world. But actually, in most rich countries, it's now pretty well stabilized or going negative. And we're going to see a considerable fall in population in some of the richest nations, which are suddenly going to want to start taking in immigrants because they're going to need younger people to be the doctors and the nurses and to be the carers.
There's an
and
economic
to do the work which
impetus.
Needs doing.
There's an economic impetus for having children in the geographical south as well, isn't there? But also there's a there's a moral impetus to make sure that women are educated in those countries as well. Let me see now. Now, Imam, I was going to go. I will be right back with you. Right after.
So I'm used to it.
What, you mean it's like being at home? Let me see now. Jay, I know you're in the fashion business, and you've got something to say about fast fashion. Fast fashion is so environmentally damaging. And also, we've got those Instagram influencers, lying by the pool in Dubai, haven't we? And not wanting to come home because they're going to have to quarantine. And they are the people who promote this stuff. So when you say that, young people are disproportionately more concerned with the environment, maybe that's true to an extent, but maybe they turn a blind eye when it comes to their own little luxuries. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's important to remember that what you see is just from the bubble that's around you. So I have to remind myself that I'm seeing a lot of people in the slow fashion circle who are very aware of needing to be on top of their consumption levels, and but also I think it's really key to remember that it's not necessarily about the materials that you use, and always being so careful to change to more responsible, more say like recycled materials, but it's more about how much of them you consume. So organic cotton isn't necessarily the most sustainable material, but if we just use less of this material, then this is what can be sustainable.
Yeah, it's an important consideration, so important. Helen, the Reverend Helen, Women of the Cloth, I know you're involved with, you're a member of Extinction Rebellion, aren't you? And you have been protesting and fighting for that cause. Do you think we can do this? Do you think COVID has and will concentrate our minds? Do you have faith in your flock?
Well, I have faith in humanity. I think one of the things that we're missing in the discussions here is the fact that an awful lot of what happened during lockdown was coming from the grassroots up, and that what gave me hope was seeing local initiatives, whether they were secular or religious, faith groups and non-faith groups, coming together in forms of mutual aid that were really inspiring. And that is my hope for future attempts to deal with other parts of climate crisis. This is a climate crisis-induced pandemic, and there will be more. And we've been looking more and more to the local response. There has been government money, but see where it's been. What it's done is has exposed even greater disparity. It's laid bare the huge injustices in our society, and it's the people in communities who have been feeding and filling those gaps. And we've seen that really clearly. And we have to build those bonds between ourselves if we're going to get through what is coming towards us, because it's not going to be easy.
And Helen,
so
much will change, Helen. And I think that when people look at what happened in the 80s, the economic devastation and the massive engine of societal change under Thatcherism, that's going to be a walk in the park compared to what is upon us now and will be in the future.
I think one of the results of that, and that is very much my lifetime, that is the story of my life, is that we have been disbanded from each other. We've lost our links between each other and between the rest of creation, being encouraged to do that by the capitalist system that we live in. And Margaret Thatcher, we all know, famously said, there is no such thing as society. It's often quoted, but that's been my experience in my lifetime, that we've been encouraged to disconnect ourselves from each other, whereas everything is related and interrelated. And it's hard to realize that. It's not an easy thing to carry, because it brings pain and sorrow, but it also brings joy, because those connections are affirming.
Okay.
But we need to rediscover them.
Yeah. That's a good point, Iman, to bring you in, Iman Asim.
Yeah.
Iman, we've lost our connection to the rest of creation, as Helen would put it, and as no doubt you would put it. Is this a chance to reset?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be difficult, but we have an opportunity, and it's a lifetime opportunity. Sometimes we talk about saving the planet or saving ourselves, but actually as if we're going to save the planet for ourselves, rather than from religious perspective. I'll say that there is a community of birds, and the Quran talks about this, the kingdom of animals. They should have their own integrity, and we should be protecting them for their own sake rather than for ourselves. And that requires a change in mindset. And the three principles that we have in Islam, one is sustainability, secondly, conservation, and thirdly, what we've been talking about here, in terms of not extravagance. There's enough for everyone's need in this world, but not for everyone's greed. And one of the things that we've learned in this pandemic is that we are interdependent. We affect each other, and health is our key asset. That's why we went into lockdown. Not sustainable, obviously, in the long term, but what we can learn is how can we bring about those small changes in our lifestyles and a bottom-up approach, but also at the same time, the governments, the corporate entities investing in infrastructures. And we've seen that change, whether it's corporate entities, if they're saying, let's not have disposable products being used or things, and people do make that change. Oxford University research has shown that if we just swap out one red meat meal a week with a vegetarian option, it will bring about change. So just thinking some of those really small changes, but not being picky with environmentally being conscious.
See, the small changes, Karen, marginal gains.
Yes, but and I do come across this kind of dialogue a lot, and people think, oh, if only I don't use plastic bags and I cycle to work, yay. Battle is won, and unfortunately that's not true. There was this, one of many studies that's come out to show just how challenging our predicament is. They found that if you were to provide a minimum standard for everyone, they were testing what standard would be achievable without the planet bursting into flames, and it was really, really low. The standard of life that can be achieved for everyone without the planet just, collapsing from our excessive demands upon it is it's not even a second degree, a secondary education for children. It's minimum sanitation in a tiny little house and no heating. It's just like very, very simple lives for everyone because there's so many of us. And I would challenge the idea that consumption is what we should be focusing on right now in our population. Both of them need to be looked at right now. Population is a very long-term commitment. It's unfunded expansion. We're basically committing ourselves to finding jobs, livelihoods, a world that can. Space is the least of our concerns. Well, actually, we have plenty of space. The problem is not space, resources. We are committing to billions of lives without having any plan about how we're going to really find jobs for them in a world that will look after them.
For us to be sitting here talking about what needs to happen, let's say you mentioned, Nikki, earlier, India or other places, in terms of, and again, that's in a way, is that right thing to do in terms of other people's choices? Not lifestyle choices, but their life choices, because we think that we can't make small changes, which may make some difference.
They matter for sure.
But I don't feel morally comfortable to be making those choices.
Yeah, but we have to look, it's a question, I suppose, people would argue that you have to look at the facts, and then you read the facts, and you look at the science, and then you have to infer from that the choices that we have to make for all of us. There is a mutualism about it.
Absolutely. It doesn't have a fossil fuel to renewable energy. That's a huge, massive change that we need to make those choices first.
I want to speak to Olivia, get another perspective. Olivia, as a Buddhist, where are you on this?
Okay, so I think it's a crisis. We've got 10 years, and that's what we need to focus on. What can we do now? My feeling is that the pandemic has given us that opportunity to really reset. It's told us to pause, but also to reset and to understand how we are completely interrelated, interdependent, and in fact one with nature and the whole environment. So I am my environment, I am planet Earth, that's what I believe. And as somebody has already said, the pandemic is an environmental issue. I also believe that we are waking up and have the potential now, the opportunity to wake up to the preciousness of life, of all life. Every single human being, all life on Earth, and that we are, again, that we can together, I believe, in a spiritual revolution in a way, change what's in our hearts, change how we behave, and enable people to believe in that change, that we can make small changes, and but we must also put pressure on our governments and the bigger organizations to systemically change. But the two are completely interconnected. As we change, we can change the norms.
Let's leave it there.
I believe that's what's happening now.
What a fantastic contribution. Great contributions from all of you. Thank you so much. If you have something to say about that debate, log on to bbc.co.uk, the big questions, follow the links. Next week, our virtual audience will be from Scotland, and the week after that, it's the West Midlands' turn. So if you live in either of those areas would like to take part, then email audience@menton.tv.